Thank you everyone. Thank you so much. Please settle down. We got a long night ahead of us. Hello, welcome to the Pickleball Nick Year in Review 2023 edition. It's been a long year. It's been a weird year for pickleball and I think for most of us. But I wanted to take the time to reflect on my year in pickleball. Oh, it feels like only yesterday that I was just a wee lad, starting out on the courts, alone, stepping in the kitchen, hitting my serves too long. I still do that, but. So the point of this video is for me to go back and revisit all of the things I've reviewed this year, as well as talk about some of the experiences I've had in and around pickleball, as well as, let me touch on some things I didn't get to make a full video about earlier in the year. A ton has changed for pickleball over the year, for me personally, and I think for the sport at large. So let's just get started back where I started a year ago, last November. Anyway, hop into the time machine with me as we go back in time. The Rockne Curve Classic. I still think it looks good, even a year later. This is the first paddle that I got. This is what got me started in the sport. I'll always be grateful for Rockne starting me on my journey. I think it's funny to look at what I did to this paddle. I've got this like really thick special tape on the edges because I was so worried about like tearing up the edge guard. It's also weighted to hell. It's so heavy. It does make me miss a little bit of the time when all the paddles weren't just like black raw carbon fiber paddles with varying like degrees of a stenciled design on the front. I do think that something has been lost with moving to mainly raw carbon fiber and the way that graphic design works on those faces, but that's just me. I tend to not weigh my paddles up anymore. I've kind of subscribed to the notion that the paddle's weight is the way it is because that's the weight it was intended to be played at, and if not, the company better have a really specific disclaimer telling me that I need to weigh it up. Otherwise, like, I'm not gonna do it. I tend to like a lighter paddle anyway because I feel like a lot of my playstyle relies on being fast and up at the net and aggressive, and I just feel a little more sluggish with these heavier paddles, even though they do let you rip it pretty hard. My technique has also improved a ton, so I think that that has really changed how I feel about heavy paddles. The face texture is like, whatever, it was solid. It did the job when I was getting started. It's a little thin for me now. But what really stuck with me about this paddle was the grip length and the paddle face shape. Looking back, I've realized how much this specific paddle shape has affected my opinion of other paddle shapes and my preferences for basically everything else moving forward, which is kind of funny. I haven't tried any more of the more recent Rockne offerings, but back when I got this, this was one of those like surprisingly effectively priced beginner paddles that was still really competitive. It was my girlfriend's first paddle and she hasn't tried any other paddle that she likes, so she sticks with it. I think it's funny, I've like put my name and my phone number here on the bottom of the paddle because I was like so worried about like, I guess losing it. But this was also the inception of me putting orange grip tape on every single paddle that I play with, which tends to do a better job of differentiating mine from the others. Anyway, this was just like a solid way for me to get started and I never feel like it held me back. I liked it. Next, let's move on to the first like serious paddle that I got, the Legacy Pro. The Legacy Pro, my first raw carbon fiber paddle. When these were first coming out, the hype was insane. And it's just crazy to look at paddles now at the end of the year and how common raw carbon fiber faces and thermoforming have become. But at that time, when this first just came out, everyone was losing their mind. This is also one of those Gen 1 paddles, like that first batch of them that came over and had a lot of issues with delamination. And not just Legacy Pro, a lot of the thermoformed paddles in that first wave had major issues with delamination where like the face would come off of the core and balls would just be like insanely fast moving. I'm too weak to hit the ball hard enough to break the paddle, so I never had the issue with delamination, but if I'm to believe the internet, it happened like every other paddle. So I really liked it on this paddle, and I still do on a lot of the paddles I play with now. The thicker thermoformed paddles, that balance of control and poppy responsiveness. When I got this paddle, it was a little bit too much for me, and when I've brought it back out since then, it's still a little too aggressive for my taste. At first I thought it was a skill issue. It still might be a little bit of a skill issue. But it's just a really power forward paddle, and that's not something that I really like. This was my go-to for a long time, however, until I kind of like reeled it back on the technological train towards something a little less cutting edge, and I actually had a better time with it, which brings us to our next paddle. So, the Rhombus R2. So when I first started talking to Rhombus, this actually wasn't the paddle that I wanted to review. I wanted to review either their Vice competitor concept paddle or one of their more popular models. But this is the one that they had in stock, and because I am a tiny speck of a presence on the internet, I wasn't gonna complain when they decided to send me something else. And I ended up being pleasantly surprised by how this paddle worked for me. The R2 is supposed to be the paddle that they have that's like designed for ping pong players. I don't really know how that works, but it's definitely more of a ping pong-y shape. It's a non-thermoformed control paddle. It's thick, it's soft, it has a humongous sweet spot. The paddle is like got a nice grip thickness. That's something that I think has mattered to me a lot more than I realized, is that if a paddle has one of those thin little ping pong-y grips, it really affects my experience playing with the paddle. As far as the raw carbon fiber surface goes on this paddle, I thought it was really solid. I thought it was good on the Legacy Pro 2, and I've thought it was good on basically every other carbon fiber paddle that I've hit with. Honestly, I don't think that paddle to paddle, if they're using the T700 carbon fiber or whatever equivalents there are, that there's much of a difference based on like the pattern that they weave in, at least not that I've been able to feel. And I've hit with a lot of paddles, as you'll see. I feel like having the raw carbon fiber surface opens the door for your skill to then let you rip the ball every which way. But I don't think that any one paddle is gonna really like empirically show better spin one way or the other. I know there's a couple other channels that do like these super serious spin tests, but like there's so many variables in each serve or whatever they use as their metric that it doesn't really feel like super useful data to me as like another random guy. I mean, when I pick a serve, I know that it can have like one of 2 or 3 outcomes, like if I aim in one specific spot or if my windup is a certain way. And as far as I know, none of those reviewers that use the spin testing as part of their review metrics are robots. So yeah, it just doesn't seem as important to me. So that's why I never end up mentioning it. I think I talk more about how I don't think it matters than I do actually talk about the texture. I have noticed other things about raw carbon fiber though, specifically about how it degrades over time, more so than how any one paddle is better than the other. But we'll get to that at the end. So that's the Rhombus R2. When it first came onto my radar, I didn't really expect much, but after spending some time with it, I was pleasantly surprised. It didn't like become my new favorite paddle overnight or anything, but not every paddle's gonna blow your socks off. The Bison Summit and the Rampage, which I don't have because I loaned it to a friend several months ago and they still haven't given it back. Because they like it, not because they're like lame. Even just having this one in my hand again, I remember how much I enjoyed it when I first found it. More so than some of the other budget raw carbon fiber paddles, this one just feels really, really solid. Same with the Rampage too, but the construction on these is just real nice. I also think as far as their design goes, for raw carbon fiber, which I think is notoriously boring, this little like etched thing is a really neat choice. These paddles were super beginner friendly, and I think really gave me a lot of confidence moving away from the more traditional paddles and towards raw carbon fiber in a way that some of the earlier thermoformed things felt a little bit more geared towards a better player. Moving on, we had the 2 Spartus Gladius paddles. I'll let you look at the grossness of each grip and you can decide which one I liked more. It was this one. So my biggest beef with the Legacy Pro was that it had a little bit too much power for me, but the Spartus Gladius 16 was basically the same thing with a little bit less available rocket ship power. It also has like 0.2 more of an inch on the handle, which I've come to realize I really like. It was around this time in the year that I realized that I really don't like the thinner, snappier feel of like a 14mm or lower paddle. It's just a little too squirrely for me. I feel like I really feel the ball coming off the face if I have to deflect. The thicker paddles are just a little bit sturdier when you're defending or trying to like take hits and take pace off the ball. The Gladius 13 was also the first paddle that I played with that had the rattle. I don't know if you can hear that, but there's a little bit of a rattle. And apparently it's because the glue seeps out in between some of the hexes and then it breaks off if you hit hard enough with it, and then it just rattles around on the paddle. It doesn't affect anything according to the paddle manufacturers themselves, but it does sound odd. I've had it happen on thick and thin paddles and across brands, so I don't know what it's about, but this was the first time I noticed it. These paddles perform on par with the 2 Bison paddles that I reviewed. They just take the same shape and push it to the far ends of the thickness and thinness spectrum. It was around this time too, like midway through the year, that my own personal tastes for paddles really started to develop to a point where I could say exactly what I wanted and liked and didn't like, regardless of what I thought of the like paddle's quality. Turns out I'm kind of vanilla. On the spectrum of power to control, I like a paddle that's pretty much right in the middle. And that's probably why I stuck with the Spartus Gladius 16 for so long. So those are all the paddles that I did a normal review for in the year, but I played with several more that I just didn't quite have enough time to make a full review for. So you get them covered now. We're gonna start out with the Gaba Rogue. This is a paddle. It's raw carbon fiber, it's not thermoformed, it's elongated, it's got a kind of a squarish octagon grip, and that's all I can really say about this paddle. It is like the most middle of the road, lower budget paddle that I can think of. The surface is fine, it's not thermoformed. I don't think the graphics are all that amazing. It's kind of the definition of an overpriced mid-tier paddle. I don't want to dunk on it too much because that feels unfair because it's a pretty small company and they seem like nice people, but yeah, it was just kind of meh. I think if you're a small company looking to get into the pickleball game, you need to bring something pretty unique to the table in order to stand out from the crowd. And I think that's where the Rogue kind of fell short. It's just so much of what we already had. But there were some companies that took some risks that I thought were interesting this year. Kiwi Labs. They're a small company based out of Michigan, and they reached out to me, in the middle of the year and asked me if I wanted to review their Kiwi Labs Slice. At first glance, I was kind of confused by this thing because it's like 20 millimeters thick, it's got kind of a shorter handle, and it's thermoformed. A weird combination of things I thought at the time. However, once I started playing with it, I liked it. I kind of enjoyed it a lot more than I thought. They gave me the one with the thick handle. Doesn't look like much here. Anyway, I don't think they sell this thickness of handle anymore, but I do like how club-like it feels. I felt like I could keep a really soft grip on the paddle without having to really like clamp down on it just because it is big in my hand. And I like that. I know some people don't, but I did. It's much closer to a tennis grip than it is like a ping pong grip or something smaller. The face is a little bit more squat and wide than a lot of other paddles with an elongated handle, and that definitely takes some getting used to because it is very much outside of the normal comfort zone of the like elongated-ish paddle with a longer handle. Even though it's 20 millimeters, I feel like because it's thermoformed, you still had enough power to drive home shots if you needed to, although I think this paddle really did shine in its short game. From a surprisingly powerful control-ish paddle, Kiwi Labs did a pretty significant pivot, I thought, and came out with the Kiwi Labs Spiked. This thing is just a cannon. I don't really have much else to say about it. I was so surprised by the amount of force that you could put on this. It felt closer to a Diadem Vice or something than most of the other paddles I've played with. This model is also a handle prototype that they sent me, just because I think it was a little oversized or undersized based on what they actually wanted to go with. But as far as the actual construction, it felt solid. It's just not the kind of thing I'm looking for in a paddle. It's pretty heavy. It's top heavy and super rigid, so I don't feel like you get a lot of touch on the ball. And I just felt like every single time I got paddle contact, I would just launch a ball into space. I'm not mad at it though, because they did try something new and they took a risk, which I don't think is easy for small companies, especially who want to try to hit the mark with every single thing they come out with. This is definitely one of the prettier paddles of the year though. I like this kind of topographic map thing that they've got going on. I don't really know what it has to do with being spiked, but it's cool. Weird, but cool. Up next, we got the Warrior V2 and the Vice. This one's, we'll talk about it in a second. I played with the Warrior V2 for a long time, like a couple months in the mid to late summer and into the fall. It became my go-to after playing with the Spartus Gladius 16 because it had a lot of the things I liked in the Gladius with just some extra features added on top. I always felt like the ball really sat for a long time on the surface of this paddle, which was nice for me because it felt like I could get a lot of top spin or back spin or side spin, and that the ball just like gave me a lot of time to work with it. That's probably a combination of the face and the thickness and everything. It's a thick paddle too, by the way. It just made me feel like I had a lot of control over the ball. I mean, it's like a 19mm thick paddle, so it makes sense. This was the first paddle I spent a long time playing with that was edgeless, and I do feel like there is something lost in terms of stability when you don't have the edge. You get a lot more negative feedback if you hit outside the sweet spot, which is, you know, for better or for worse. Honestly, this paddle is so thick, you do lose a little bit of sensation even if you do have good command with it. You also lose a little bit of power, but I felt like I was okay sacrificing that because of the other control metrics that I felt like I was stronger in. This paddle eventually kind of fell out of my lineup just because it wasn't quite what I wanted, even though I felt like I had a solid game with it. The not insignificant lack of feel relative to thinner paddles was something that I eventually figured I should just move on from, even though I did like other things about this paddle. I do think this paddle makes a lot of sense though when compared with two of its predecessors, the Diadem Vice and the Warrior V1. I don't have one, but I've hit on it a few times. Anyway, the Vice is an expensive lesson in experimental design that I think Diadem learned a lot from based on feedback. It's a super quiet paddle, but it is so strange to hit with. It sounds like every single hit is a mishit, even if you hit right in the center, which is probably due to the entire thing being made out of EVA foam. But I see a lot of similarities to the build in the Warrior V2 from the Vice, and I can see where the designers took things from the Vice and put it into the V2 in a more legal package. At the end of the day, I always felt like this paddle was a bit of an enigma because it's got the price point of like a really nice high quality paddle, but it was illegal for tournaments. So I was kind of confused who was supposed to be using this. I'm definitely glad to have one as a bit of like pickleball history and you know, a step in the development of the modern pickleball paddle. But I never quite got this one. I'd always hand it around to people that I played with and be like, here, try this one out. It's illegal, but let's see what happens. And I was always kind of hoping that there would be someone that this paddle would really click with and then it would suddenly make sense. Oh, this is just kind of a niche thing that will have a place in the future, but I never found anyone like that. Everyone thought it was a strange, dull sounding mystery joke machine. As far as pickleball memes though, this one is up there with the really high lob serve in that I'll pull it out every now and then just to, you know, have a few laughs. That brings us to the final paddle that I've spent a significant amount of time with this year. It's the bread and butter Filth. This is a 16mm thermoformed elongated paddle, and it has been my go-to since I got it, pretty much. Before I say anything more about the Filth, I do want to let y'all know that I did a little bit of work for them at the MLP Atlanta Open, giving out some paddles and, you know, making some content for them. So there is a prior relationship there. However, from the moment I got this paddle, it's been my go-to, just because it's like really solid across the board and doesn't try to reinvent the wheel in a good way. That doesn't make any sense. I feel like you get the benefits of a thermoformed paddle in that it is solid and powerful, but it takes a little bit of power off the top in a way that makes this paddle much more accessible than things like the Carbon 1Xs and the Legacy Pros. I don't think this paddle tried to compromise anything with its design, and so the end result is this pretty solid looking, solidly priced, middle of the road thermoformed paddle that does everything medium well. And ultimately that's kind of what I want. I don't want to have to make some big skew decision into power or control oriented paddles when my game is kind of all over the place, and I feel like pickleball is in general too. Like most games, a big component of pickleball is knowing your opponent and knowing what they're good at and recognizing their strengths and weaknesses as you're playing. And I think if you have a paddle that's forcing you into one situation over the other, like a paddle that's super powerful and encourages you to just take every single drive and smash the ball as hard as you can, you're gonna cue your opponents into maybe that your short game is a little weaker, or that they need to play another way, and if they're solid, they'll recognize that pretty quickly. On the flip side of that, if you play with a paddle that's super soft and control-oriented, you'll just get hit at all day if you can't speed anything up. Or if you finally do get the opponents on a defensive pull away from the net, sometimes it just really takes a lot more out of you to have to crank out those overheads and put more behind them than you'd have to with a otherwise stronger, more power-forward paddle. And I think that the Filth is pretty much right in the middle in terms of those two extremes of control or power. And I like that, and I think a lot more people need that more than they need to really push one side of their game versus the other. I think training, getting out to the court is really what's gonna make those difference in those areas that you're weak in, unless you're moving your gear around to make yourself better at things that you really should just be practicing more on. I think it's kind of funny that one of my favorite paddles of the year is being made by a company that's really focused on the more casual pickleball player. I think With the Filth bread and butter can kind of have their cake and eat it too, in that they have like a cool kind of aesthetic paddle that is also pretty high performing, and they can like swing with the big boys. I've not gotten to play with it, but their Loco paddle seems to also be getting really solid reviews from what I can tell. So I'm excited to see what the future holds for bread and butter. So I wanted to end this section with a bit of a like paddle tier list overall thing, but I feel like a lot of these paddles are competing for different audiences, so it didn't really make sense. I'm gonna break it down into two camps. If you're looking for a paddle that's like right around $100 or less, the Spartus Gladius 16 is probably gonna be my go-to. It was a solid performer for me all year, and it doesn't really do anything special, but that's not the purpose of a beginner paddle. It's to give you a solid foundation from which you can grow on. We're gonna put the other paddles I liked this year in the big boy thermoformed category. The Warrior V2 or the Kiwi Labs Slice if you want something that breaks the conventional pickleball paddle molds, and the bread and butter Filth if you want something that's like right in the center of everything. And finally, for my most played paddles of the year, the Diadem Warrior V2 and the bread and butter Filth. While the Diadem Warrior V2 has some more pronounced strengths and weaknesses than the bread and butter Filth, I still appreciate what it does bring to the table, whereas the bread and butter Filth is such a all-around solid option that I just feel myself coming back to it more and more often. I don't think you can go wrong with either one personally, but I do think you should try to demo the Warrior V2 before you give it a go. The next thing I want to talk about is balls. I've only done one large review on a ball, and then I did another shorter first look on one, but I've probably played with around 10 different balls over the course of the year. As far as the high performance balls go, I feel like you have to pick between one of two different downsides. They're either brittle, but they keep their round, or they become egg-shaped, and they go out around, but they'll never actually crack. Currently, I don't think there's like a silver bullet special ball that can solve all the problems or that doesn't have one of those two drawbacks, at least on the competitive side, and until that happens, I think it's gonna hold pickleball back a little bit. I'm not holding my breath for some sort of super ball that never breaks, but I do think there's a lot of space for a new competitive standard ball to take the stage. As far as bags go, I've used one all year and see no point in switching. It's the Concha paddle bag. I really appreciate how subtle it is for a paddle bag, and it's almost over-engineered, but it does exactly what I need it to do. I like how minimalist the design is. It does everything I need a paddle bag to do without any extra frills, and it doesn't scream pickleball, like there's no big logo down the side or anything. I don't know, it's just really solid. Definitely like a more luxury item in terms of cost, but if you're gonna spend the money, I think this is where you want to do it. Unless you're like a walking paddle merchant and you have to carry 15 paddles at a time, you don't need any of those bigger bags. There is one more bit of gear that I want to talk about, and it's become so much of a part of my pickleball identity, you might not even recognize me now without it. I'm talking about all my hats. So I've been playing pickleball in like 3 separate companies' hats pretty much the entire year. Outdoor Research, CL, and Fractal, but CL and Fractal are the ones that have really kept my attention. Their colorful designs and lightweight flexible bills really do it for me. A lot of pickleball or tennis-focused hats, they're really thick and rigid in a way that I don't really like. And all of these hats that I've been wearing are actually running hats, and that just kind of means that they're super thin and really flexible. They're designed to kind of pack away a little bit more efficiently. The material on the top of these hats is almost like a thin basketball short sort of material, like it's even thinner than that, but it's just super breathable and lightweight. The brims are also super flexible and come in these like varying sizes, right? So you can get the small little brim or these longer ones. Near the end of the spring, Fractal sent me out some of these hats to try out, and so props for them, you know, being brave enough to send a bunch of running equipment to a random pickleball YouTuber. Comparing the two brands, Fractal has slightly more understated colors. They do a little bit more in like pastels and earth tones. Their retention system in the back is stretchy, so you get a little bit more of a snug and flexible fit. And their bucket hats, which are probably my favorite. I prefer Fractal's cinching system over CL's just because it locks in a way that the CL ones don't. See what I mean here on the CL ones? It's like this little disc, and it doesn't really It'll stay, but if you cinch it down, it'll slowly pull away from your head. I get my bucket hats in large and then I cinch them all the way down, and that's a perfect fit for me. But there's a lot of room, so if you have like a super Megamind sized head, you can really get this thing to go huge. The fractal hats are also a little bit deeper, and that coupled with the elastic retention probably makes them my hat of the year. For both breathability and retention, I think these fractal hats are my favorite. They go on sale pretty regularly throughout the year, so I've been able to stock up on the colors that I wanted. But if you're tired of like a standard ball cap, I'd really check these out. So that's been my year and stuff in pickleball, but let's talk about how I feel. When I started playing pickleball a year ago, I had no idea what this sport was gonna have in store for me. I tend to have pretty intense hyperfixations on a sport or a hobby or whatever. I get really into it for a couple months and then it kind of floats away. But pickleball has really stayed with me, and that's not just because of the sport itself, but also the community around it. Pickleball's relatively low entry point cost, as well as the democratization of courts and the fact that it's a game you can play at a lot of public parks, has really given it a lot of staying power for me. I also really appreciate that it's like had me interacting with older generations that I normally wouldn't run across in my normal day-to-day and other hobbies that I'm into. I definitely feel like interacting with that older demographic, like people 55 and up, has really helped me to understand kind of their view of the world in a bit of a way. Like, that sounds a little profound, and I guess it has been for me. I'm like regularly interacting with people that are my parents' age, but that have no prior connection, like I didn't grow up knowing them. And it's just been a very fascinating like social experience. And I think that that's pretty unique to pickleball. And I don't think I'm alone in interacting with people in a new way because of the sport. The first year I lived in Atlanta, I didn't really feel like I connected with any communities. And it wasn't until the second year that I've lived here that I really started to feel like I was able to push out my roots and reach into communities, and pickleball has been one of those foundational groups that I feel like I've really built my friend group up around, and I'm gonna be pretty eternally grateful to it for that alone. I play Dungeons and Dragons, or a game similar to it, every other weekend, and about half my group are people that I met through pickleball. If you had told me a year ago that I was gonna have a chance to work with some rising pickleball companies, I wouldn't have believed you either. But I've been super grateful for the opportunities I've been given by Bread and Butter Pickleball and Pickleball Union. I covered the PPA event here in Atlanta in May for Pickleball Union, and it was my first time at a pro pickleball event, and I had such a blast working for them and covering the event. It's really made me excited for how the sport has legs as a professional competitive venture when you see those highest levels of players playing. They're just so much better. Similarly, working the MLP Atlanta event for Bread and Butter, even though I was not really watching as many games, being able to see the camaraderie and like the team rivalry stuff happening was really fun, and a unique take on the pickleball formula that I think has legs moving forward. Unless they self-implode, promising pros way too much with their contracts. So what do I have in store for 2024? Well, I don't really know. I'm pushing harder to do more work in the pickleball space. A lot of my training and job stuff right now is in and related to media production, and I think marrying that to my enjoyment of pickleball has been really rewarding for me previously, so I want to keep diving into that. But I also want to experiment with some more longer form content that isn't reviews here on YouTube. So if y'all have anything that you want to see from me, then let me know down in the comments. If you're part of a pickleball community here in the Southeast and you want to hook up with me, I'd also love to explore some other pickleball communities around the Southeast, like within a couple hours of Atlanta. So if you're part of one and you think you've got something worth sharing, let me know. That about wraps it up for me. But, you know, folks, it's been a great year. It's been a bad year. Either way, it's about to be over. So I hope you enjoy the holidays. It's Pickleball Nick, and I'll see you in the new year. That sign off kind of sucks. I don't know. I don't have like a catchphrase though. I think that's it though.